Hello guys, in today's video I'm going to talk about active transport, and we'll start off by thinking about what active transport actually is. We'll then move on to discuss the role of membrane proteins in active transport, and then to discuss the role of active transport in important biological processes. We'll then finish off with some exam style questions to help tie everything together. So, what is active transport? Well, active transport is a cellular transport process that requires energy to move substances across biological membranes. And this energy comes from the hydrolysis of ATP, as with many other processes that require energy in living organisms. But when we think about other transport processes like diffusion and facilitated diffusion, these are passive and do not require energy. So why, when we have these processes that don't require energy, do we need active transport, which does require energy? Well, with diffusion and facilitated diffusion, we get the movement or transport of molecules from an area of high concentration to one of low concentration. Or in other words, we get a movement of molecules down their concentration gradient. But sometimes we need to transport molecules from an area of low concentration to one of high concentration. And this requires energy, as it's moving against the concentration gradient. And this is where active transport comes in, where energy is used to transport molecules against their concentration gradient. So we know that we need energy from ATP hydrolysis to drive the movement of molecules against their concentration gradient and to be transported across biological membranes. But how do we harness this energy from ATP hydrolysis to drive this movement of molecules? Well, this is where membrane proteins come in. And so much like facilitated diffusion, active transport requires specialized membrane proteins, or active transporters. These transporters utilize the energy from ATP hydrolysis to pump molecules against their concentration gradient. Also, similar to the carrier proteins involved in facilitated diffusion, active transporters are complementary to the specific molecule that they transport. So think of it like a lock and key. Only certain molecules, the key, fit inside certain active transporters, the lock. And indeed we can see this with the diagram down here. So we can see that this molecule here has the right shape to fit inside this active transporter. And indeed, when this molecule collides with the active transporter uses the energy from ATP hydrolysis to shift or pump a molecule across a membrane and into an area of higher concentration against its concentration gradient. And the area of higher concentration of this molecule, in this instance, is the intracellular side of this membrane, or in other words, inside the cell. Now the reason we don't get this transporter transporting the molecule back outside of the cell is because once the transporter delivers the molecule to the inside of the cell in this case, it is no longer complementary to the molecule. And so the molecule cannot be transported back out of the cell. But the transporter does turn around, shift back to collect the next molecule, which it now becomes complementary for again. And we can get many cycles of this to pump molecules from an area of low concentration, which is the extracellular side of this membrane, to an area of high concentration, which is the intracellular side of this membrane. But why do we need this? What is the role of this active transport in biology? Well, there are a number of processes that require active transport, a number of biological processes. And one example I'm going to talk you through, which you'll need to know for the exam, is sucrose loading into the phloem. So we can see here the sieve tube cells, and the companion cell here. And these cells make up the phloem. And in the first stage of sucrose loading into the phloem, we use the energy of ATP hydrolysis to pump out hydrogen ions, which is via a specialised membrane transporter, like the one I showed you previously. And so we get the active transport of hydrogen ions outside of the cell. This increases the hydrogen ion concentration outside of the companion cells. And we need this active transport to keep on pumping these hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient to this area of higher concentration. Why? Well, we have this higher concentration of hydrogen ions here, and because they're at a higher concentration outside of the companion cell, they're pushing to come back in to the companion cell. They want to move down their concentration gradient back into the companion cell where there is a lower concentration of hydrogen ions. And this is indeed what they do. Hydrogen ions return to the companion cells, but what they do is they also bring sucrose along with them. And to do this, they use a specialised co-transporter. And so hydrogen ions travel down the concentration gradient by facilitated diffusion. This co-transporter here facilitates the diffusion of hydrogen ions back into the companion cell, but what they bring along with them is sucrose. This sucrose can then diffuse into the sieve tube via these plasmodesmata. So sucrose can diffuse into the sieve tube and then be transported around the plant to various tissues and to essentially keep the plant alive. And so to reiterate, we can see that hydrogen ions are actively transported out of the cell to the area of higher concentration. But then we use this hydrogen ion concentration gradient to pull in sucrose into the cell, which can then be used by the plant after it's been transported around. And so we can see how active transport can play a key role in a greater biological process. And this is just one of many examples, but other examples you'll need to know for the exam are the uptake of ions such as nitrates and phosphates into root hair cells, and also glucose uptake into the cells lining the small intestine. So these are two other examples that you'll need to know. And you'll need to also understand how the active transport plays a role in the overall biological process. And so now we'll move on to some exam style questions. And we'll start with this one. So you may get a question that says something like, state 2 examples of active transport in cells, and for each example, name the substance being transported and the cell involved. So here are my 2 answers. We've got transport of nitrates into root hair cells, and we've got, like the previous example that we went through, the transport of hydrogen ions out of companion cells. Now with this question, it would be important to remember to write down the specific names of the substances and the cell involved, like the question asked. And so you can see I've written nitrates and hydrogen ions instead of just ions or molecules. We can also see I've written root hair cells and companion cells rather than writing just the roots or the phloem. You have to write down the specific cells. It's also very important to make sure you get the direction of transport correct. So the transport of nitrates into root hair cells and the transport of hydrogen ions out of companion cells, as you saw with the diagram I showed you previously. And if you get these directions of transport wrong, you may lose marks, so make sure you get those correct. Another question may ask you to go into a bit more detail. So, describe how sucrose molecules are actively loaded into the phloem. And so we've been through this example, and there's many things you can say. So hydrogen ions pumped out of the companion cells, an increased hydrogen ion concentration outside the companion cells, which means the hydrogen ions can then flow back into the companion cells down their concentration gradient via a co-transporter protein. And it could be important to note that this is facilitated diffusion, as these hydrogen ions are travelling down their concentration gradient. So we've got the active transport first, but then this facilitated diffusion, which is secondary to this initial active transport. It's driven by this initial active transport. You can then go on to talk about what happens to the sucrose after it's transported into the companion cells, and so you can say it diffuses into the sieve tube via the plasmodesmata. What would be important with this question is to think chronologically and carefully about what is involved in each step. So think about what happens in each step, make sure you get all the components of each step written down to give you the maximum chance of getting all the marks for a question like this one. And so in summary, active transport requires energy from ATP, the hydrolysis of ATP, and it is used to transport molecules against the concentration gradient. Specialized membrane proteins are required to do this, or active transporters. And this active transport plays a key role in important biological processes, as I exampled with sucrose loading into the phloem. And remember that you need to know and understand the examples that I've mentioned. So sucrose loading into the phloem, ion uptake into the root hair cells, and glucose uptake in the cells lining the small intestine. Well, that's all for now, and thank you very much for listening.